We can't change everything, but changing the planetary energy system involves changing transportation, changing the structure of the cities, changing the agricultural systems, and it would only cost 2 or 3% of GDP, a couple of $1 trillion a year, because the rich can afford to pay it out of the annual increase in their wealth. They wouldn't even have less money. I mean, people do not seem to understand how much money the rich have. It's astonishing.
Welcome. I'm Dale Wolkonen, and this is Facing Future. Since the 2015 Paris Agreement, the world's richest 1% have increased their wealth by close to $34 trillion, enough to end global poverty 22 times over. This grotesque inequality, in which the wealthiest 10% are estimated to have added a whopping 2/3 of global warming since 1990, is a climate catastrophe. Is climate justice possible given these odds? To answer this question, I'm joined today by my co-host, Herb Simmons, who will introduce our guest, Tom Anastasiou.
Thank you, Dale. And I am so delighted that you're with us, Tom. Tom is the founder and the executive director of a small but very powerful and important nonprofit organization based, I guess, virtually, but you're in California, ecoequity.org. And Tom, you've been, as you describe it in your website, a specialist in global climate equity. I would say, from what I know of you, more than a specialist, one of the leaders in this critically important movement over the last several decades. You'll say it more eloquently than I will, but it's dealing with the great problem of shaping a planetary climate transition that is fair enough to actually succeed both within the U.S. and around the world. You've been a writer, a number of books. I won't go through them right now, but we'll put a link to your website so that people can learn more about you. So thanks for coming today, Tom. And I just want to start by picking up on what Dale said, that remarkable and albeit depressing statistic about the trillions of dollars, literally, that the rich in the world have accumulated just in the past decade or so. And how does that relate to your work and your philosophy and the approach, not just of you personally, but the organizations and people that you work with every day to bring equity to the climate world?
Well, I mean, we're trying to answer the question of what would be fair in an emergency transition. And we still think that question is relevant, even though our country has been taken over by Martians. We don't think they're going to maintain their hold forever. And eventually we're going to have to get back to asking really difficult questions. And the answer succinctly is that I believe you have to look at the world as being twice divided between rich and poor and north and south, and that neither dimension of inequality is sufficient to capture the dilemmas that we have to face and have to solve in order to stabilize the climate system. The statistic that Dale started with is a well-chosen one. It's one of the most shocking of all statistics. And it's particularly important to stress how much carbon the super rich, the rich and the super rich, have generated since 1990 and since the Paris Agreement. That, in a nutshell, I think is the answer. That you have to think about both north, south, and rich, poor.
And you've been doing that, and your organization has been doing that. I've looked at a number of your reports with all sorts of really valuable and probably not easy to find or compile statistics on levels of inequality and the capacity of nations to address climate change. I first got to know you at the Climate Action Network when you were developing or had developed, and along with your colleagues, the whole fair share methodology that basically said about the rich countries that they had to go beyond 100% of emission reductions. Tell us a little bit more about how you developed that, what it is, and where that stands today.
Let me take a step back and just say that usually when people think about climate justice, they think about how the climate crisis affects the weak and the vulnerable and the innocent, which is absolutely fundamental to any kind of climate justice politics. We are trying to look at a different climate justice problem, which is how can we transition to another world, another civilization that doesn't puncture the planetary limits, the planetary boundaries. And this is largely a question of who pays for the transition. And how can you do that fairly? And that's the problem we've been trying to solve. That's the problem that has bedeviled the international negotiations for decades. I mean, it's easy to say that money is not the whole problem, and it's not by a long shot, but it's a fundamental part of the problem. And this is really clear in the poor parts of the world. So
well, Tom, what is the transition, that we're going to? It's not just putting money somewhere or putting technology somewhere. It has a lot to do with restoring the habitat. It's not just human beings. Also, there's a whole lot of, we've destroyed most of the animal life. So what does that look like if we had some sort of a plan to make a transition what would the sustainable world look like? We won't have fossil fuels, but is it going to be renewable energy, or is it going to be nuclear, or how does it work?
Well, first of all, I'm kind of allergic to reducing this question to a discussion of technology. My sense is that we really only need two things to save human civilization and to save the biosystem as we know it. And those two things are a thoroughgoing green technology revolution and a high cooperation world. And almost always people immediately collapse this into a conversation about technology, when in fact the technology problem is not solved exactly, but we know directionally what we have to do. We know what breakthroughs we still have to make. We know about the deployment challenges. The question is how we're going to cooperate to do so, given a world that is literally being torn apart by economic and political forces. And how are we going to pay for it? How are we going to mobilize the resources that we need to do it? With respect to where we're going, I mean, it is absolutely, I think the brutal truth of the matter, unless we stabilize the climate system, we cannot hope to restore the ecosystem. And unless we phase out fossil energy very rapidly, we cannot hope to stabilize the climate system. So we have to deal with the problem of prioritization and sequencing. And the key issue now, which everybody knows is the key issue because of the way the politics of fossil fuels have evolved in the last couple of years, is phasing out fossil energy as rapidly as possible, which means replacing it with renewable energy, obviously. But that's just the thin edge of the wedge. If you want to talk about how we structure, how we imagine a sustainable society, in a way, that's not our problem. It's like Marx once long ago said, we cannot write the recipes for the kitchens of the future, right? It's like our goal is to make sure that there are kitchens in the future and people can write their own recipe.
That there's something to be served from those kitchens.
And there's something to be served in those kitchens.
Putting better agriculture and appropriate agriculture is so important to the process and getting rid of
Yes.
animal agriculture, which is destroying so much of the carbon sequestration capabilities and also of habitats. And, I think animal agriculture is as big a problem. It's right up there with getting rid of the fossil fuels, is getting rid of the grazing animals that we eat, because that's just proved to be enormously destructive how we handle agriculture. I don't know if your group deals with the agricultural aspect of this or not.
No, not really. But if I may be honest, you're going again into the technology stuff. Ag is another technology problem, like transportation, like habitat, like housing, like industry. What I'm saying is all these problems are solvable. All these problems are solvable. We have thousands of good ideas. The question is why these good ideas never get put into practice. And that's a question of power and money. That's the way I look at it.
Sure. Well, cooperation doesn't seem very likely right now with all the warfare that's going on and the incredibly divided planet that we have. It just seems like an incredible leap to imagine that we would be a cooperative world order. But maybe these things can happen in a sudden leap, but with a catastrophe or two. I don't know.
My experience, which is somewhat limited, but is that there are dozens, maybe hundreds of bilateral agreements on particular sectors. In my book, A Climate Vocabulary of the Future, I coined the term climalateralism, that in the absence of major international agreements in Baku or in Belém or coming up in Turkey, and you've written about that, there's much that can be achieved and has been achieved, certainly not nearly enough. For blocks of countries, blocks of industries to work together. In your work and the work of EcoEquity, do you have preferred options for how to move towards progress? I mean, how to see if the word is seize power or gain power or transform power, whatever language you want to use, Tom. You've done a wonderful job in your reports outlining the scope of the problem and the magnitude of the need.
Yeah, I think that Herb, we're getting into a fairly desperate situation at the moment, and it looks different in different places and to different people. People have a lot of different priorities. We're clearly not going to achieve any kind of sustainability transition if we're overtaken by global war. We're clearly not going to be able to stabilize the climate system unless we phase out oil and gas and coal very, very rapidly. There's clearly a million things that have to be done in order to make that possible. And one of them is a pervasive sense of fairness. One of them is a sense that there's got to be, in order for any kind of a cooperative transition to take place, there has to be a sense that is shared in Nebraska and Namibia, that countries and classes are paying their way, doing their part, doing their fair share. And on the question of revolution and how much things have to change, it's a very difficult question because we can't change everything, but changing the planetary energy system involves changing transportation. It involves changing the structure of the cities. It involves changing the agricultural systems. And it would only cost 2 or 3% of GDP, a couple of $1 trillion a year, which is basically chump change because the rich can afford to pay it out of the annual increase in their wealth. They wouldn't even have less money. I mean, people do not seem to understand how much money the rich have. It's astonishing. And they've basically taken everything. And in this context, you think about the problem of the North and the South. And yeah, there's also billionaires in China, and there are billionaires in China, and they need to pay their fair share too, right? But what I'm saying is that in this huge sea of transformations that need to occur, we have to understand that it's not going to happen unless it's seen as fair by people everywhere. And that's a very, very difficult challenge. And the UN negotiations have to succeed because they're the only place where all of these different voices come together in one place, and that may still be possible. I mean, even after this war, maybe if we're lucky, this war will
These many
cost.
wars, I mean, they're fighting all over the planet. There's lots of wars going on everywhere. The last COP, after it, the Conference of the Willing is coming up, which is an interesting development in Colombia, sponsored by the Netherlands and Colombia. It's coming up soon. Piggybacking on what Herb was saying, maybe these have to be sort of regional get-togethers of people, because the COP process is so dominated by the fossil fuel, 1,600 fossil fuel executives at the last one, and similarly in the previous, run by the fossil fuel people. And what you're saying is, yes, of course, we were all with you there, but what is the practical means of achieving world orders that don't include the powers that are destroying it, because they don't seem to want to get on board?
Well, you made let's take this from the Santa Marta conference, which you just made a reference to. It was instigated by the Colombians. The Dutch are very involved. It's actually called the First International Conference on the Fossil Fuel Transition. I'm very involved in this conference. I have many friends who are very involved in this conference. A couple of things need to be said about it relative to positioning it with respect to the UN. One is that the fossil lobbyists are not welcome in Colombia, and two, the outcome of the Colombia conference is in a still yet undefined way going to be folded back into the main line of the climate negotiations. And the Brazilians are still very involved in that. They still co-hold the presidency, which is transitioning to the Turkish and the Australians. And people really want in Colombia to be practical. That is to say, they want to be able to come back to the mainline UN process and say, we need to do A, B, C, D. We need to form these clubs, these coalitions of the willing. We need to pass these laws. We need to make these treaties. And everything is focused on the fossil fuel phase out because as I've been trying to explain, there's now an international consensus that that's the keystone issue. If you can move it, you can move a lot of other things. If you can't move it, you can't move anything else. And the US-Israeli attack on Iran kind of proves this, right? It's all about oil and blah, 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 So,
Yes.
so that conference will be very interesting and very important. It will not be the end. It's the beginning of a new process that's going to have, there's going to be a new chain of meetings that are focused on the fossil fuel phase out. But it is abundantly clear to the organizers of the Santa Marta conference that the finance problem is a keystone problem, and they don't really know how to deal with it. And this is why we're having input into the conference, and why other people who are policy oriented and academically oriented are also having, because everybody's got ideas, even on the finance side. Even when it comes to moving billions and trillions of dollars around, there's 1,000 good ideas. It's amazing. You can't walk in any direction through the poly crisis without tripping over a good idea. So we're all super super optimistic or at least super hopeful about the Santa Marta conference.
Well, if there are all these good ideas, and I agree with you on that, if you were to answer my question, which you have been able to, and I'm sure you will be willing to, which one or two ideas do you or the colleagues you trust and work with most closely feel have the most promise in terms of actually putting real resources in the hands of those nations that have the need for it?
Yeah, that's a good focused question. I think that we we need if we actually intend to stabilize the climate system, right? We have to very, very rapidly build out renewables. And that means we have immediately got a fantastically difficult challenge slash opportunity, which is that the Chinese are very heavily investing in renewable energy and dominate solar, look like they're going to dominate batteries, dominate EV, already dominate EV. And this is not to mention the stuff that's going on in AI and manufacturing technology and high-speed trains. So the question is, how can we leverage the Chinese manufacturing capacity in a way that works for everybody rather than provoking a trade war? Right. I mean, and so that's one of the really, really, really pressing questions. And many, many things will depend on whether that can be resolved in a way that's acceptable both to the Chinese and to the Europeans and the Americans that look to have their manufacturing sectors completely decimated. This is one thing. Another thing is that there has to be a huge amount of finance for adaptation and loss and damage and just transition. And the fairness question comes up, the who pays question comes up in that regard very, very aggressively, right? That the equatorial regions of the planet are going to get very, very hot. And there's going to be hundreds of millions of people on the move. So the adaptation and disaster management aspects of the problem are going to be absolutely fundamental. And that takes you right up against the new right, which uses the immigration issue as a wedge to make people hate each other. So the second huge issue that we have to solve is how are we going to develop a politics and a culture around immigration that works for people who are afraid of change in the global north, while also allowing people to move when they have to. Most people would prefer to stay at home and be able to live in the environments that they are familiar with, but some people are going to have to move. So that's two examples of really, really pressing geopolitical, geoecological challenges that are going to have to be faced. Neither one of them is going to be possible if the 1%, the 2% of the planet's population continues to appropriate 80% of its wealth. There simply is no path forward that doesn't involve economic redistribution on a large scale. And the good news is that a lot of people know this. One of the things that's really interesting that's happening in the last couple of years is there's been an emerging overlap between the climate justice people and the tax justice people, and an increasing understanding that the two agendas have to be taken as aspects of one single overarching agenda. So that gets you into tax havens and all this hoo-ha. So, everything's connected, right?
Yes. Yes.
Yes,
You've said it so eloquently. And I just have one quick, almost yes or no question, even though if we had more time, you've just opened up these huge, critically important issues that we can only touch the surface on today. But I was very intrigued by your comments about the potential of China and their leadership to be, and their economic prowess to be a lever for the world. Are they coming to the Columbia Conference?
Yes.
That's a very good question, actually. Neither the Chinese nor the Indians
Mm.
were invited by the conference organizers
What?
to have major delegations. And I don't know exactly who's being invited, but the conference organizers really want to begin this process with the 80 or so countries that are affirmatively committed
I
to
see. Yeah.
fossil fuel phase out,
So
so
they
that
want unanimity, right? They
they
want
want to focus
unity.
on fossil fuel phase out. And in both India and China, there are groups that really want to phase
Yeah.
out fossil fuels, but other groups that don't, right? And so there's that focus isn't there. But there is disagreement on this point.
Oh boy.
Well,
Oh
at some
boy.
point, they're going to have to be looped into the process. India, I remember in Glasgow, they were the ones who said, you can't phase out coal. We could maybe phase it down. What? That
Exactly.
was India. India
That's
is in the
exactly.
crosshairs of climate change. It's appalling what's going to happen in India and is happening in India with the Himalaya region and et
Yeah,
cetera. But
exactly.
China, it does seem, you're right. China, there's great awareness in China. Some people say China is the hope of the world because they seem to be able and willing to do certain things. On the other hand, they have lots of coal plants starting
Those
again.
coal plants are on their way out.
Yeah.
I hope so. Yeah.
Mhm.
But China is very big on restoring land areas as well. And they also are going into other countries. They have the belts and um, what is it, Belts and Roads Initiative in Africa, where they're trying to really move forward other countries and sort of extend their influence, of course. But, really at this point, better them than our current administration trying to extend its
Yeah,
influence anywhere. But
Yeah.
beyond Mr. Trump, we may have a really good administration and we may have world cooperation if the pendulum swings way back there. So let's be hopeful.
Well, and your work, Tom, and the work of your groups will help prepare people to be able to act quickly and decisively if and when the political conditions change. I mean, it's essential to have a plan ready, to put on the desk the first day that the right politician comes in or the right interest group in a particular country. And more power to you. Let me turn it
or
back
at
to,
least, if
yeah.
not a plan, at least an agenda, and at
Okay.
least a shared set of principles and an understanding that equity has to be front and center, and not just equity in an abstract sense, but equity in terms of transferring technology and redistributing wealth and income, right?
Yes. I mean, that's
Absolutely.
very eloquently said. I mean, I say plan because my background is a city planner, so
Yeah,
that's
there
my
you go.
default.
Right. No,
But
the
you're right.
planning is essential. The planning is essential, but we can't plan. I mean,
Yeah,
in this country, plan.
yeah, yeah. No, we
There's
can't
some
even.
plans, but they're not very pretty.
Yeah,
Well, this has been a very interesting conversation, Tom. Thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate your participation and your ideas, and all the best for the conference that's coming up in Colombia very soon.
Okay. Okay. Thank you very much. It's been a
yeah,
pleasure talking to you.
yeah. And I just like to say, I hope maybe you'll come back at some point and we can have a follow-up program and find out what happened in Colombia. And those of you
Yeah.
who are viewers, we will keep you posted as we find out what happens. I think it's next month in Colombia.
It is.
And
It's at the end of April.
yeah,
Can I just say one last thing about the Columbia? There's actually three conferences at Columbia. One is an academic conference,
mhm.
one is a civil society conference, and then third is the official conference, which the first two are going to feed into. And
Okay.
so it's going to be a very interesting experiment.
Oh, very different than the cops. Uh, well, let me just tell our viewers, please go to
Dot
echoequity.org,
org.
.org. Support the work that Tom is doing and your colleagues. Keep up the good work, and we're behind you. That's all I can say. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.